Hi, my name is Krishana Barker, and today I'm going to be talking to you guys about how systemic racism affects education in the United States. Imagine two students with the same motivation and potential. One goes to a school with a small class size, updated textbooks, and counselors ready to help. The other goes to an overcrowded school with outdated resources and few supports. At first glance, they seem equally capable, but their opportunities are anything but equal. Horace Mann once said, "Education is the great equalizer of the conditions of man." I interpret this to mean that education should give every student an equal chance to succeed, no matter their background. I agree with this idea in principle, but systemic racism in schools shows us that this ideal is not yet reality. Today, I will show how systemic racism affects students of color through three key areas: unequal funding, biased discipline, and long-term impact on students' outcome. Let's start by looking at the resources student receives in their school. Schools that serve mostly students of color receive far less funding than predominantly white schools, according to the U.S. Department of Education. These schools receive billions of dollars less each year. For example, a high school in a low-income, predominantly black neighborhood might have outdated textbook, limited technology, and no full-time counselors. Meanwhile, a school in a predominantly white, wealthier area may have advanced science labs, multiple counselors, and smaller class sizes. One student might struggle to take AP courses because the school couldn't afford them, while the other one has every opportunity available. These differences don't just affect learning day to day. They shape the trajectory of students' future. Students in underfunded schools often have lower test scores, fewer college acceptance, and limited access to extracurricular programs. Unequal funding is one of the clearest examples of how systemic racism continues to create barriers in education. Now that we looked at the resources, let's explore how systemic racism affects students' discipline. Another major area is disciplinary practices. Data from the U.S. Department of Education Offices for Civil Rights show that black students are suspended or expelled at a much higher rate than white students for the same behavior. For instance, a black student might be suspended for being late or talking back, while a white student with the same behavior receives a warning. This can remove students from the classroom, causing them to miss lessons, fall behind in coursework, or even lose motivation. Over time, this contributes to the school-to-prison pipeline, where disproportionate discipline pushes students into the criminal justice system rather than supporting their education. Counselors, restorative justice programs, and anti-bias training for teachers are ways school can combat these disparities, but they are not yet universally implemented. Finally, let's look at the long-term consequences of these inequalities. Systemic racism in education doesn't stop at high school students. It doesn't stop at high school. Students who experience underfunded schools and biased discipline face long-term disadvantages. They are less likely to attend school, earn higher wages, or have access to certain career opportunities. For example, studies show that students from underfunded schools are more likely to drop out, while students with access to robust resources are more likely to succeed academically and professionally. This gap perpetuates economic inequality and limits social mobility, keeping cycles of disadvantage in place for entire communities. These long-term effects show that systemic racism in education is not just a classroom problem, it's a societal problem. Now that we see how systemic racism affects funding, discipline, and long-term outcome, let's wrap it up. Horace Mann said, "Education is the great equalizer of the conditions of man." We interpret this to mean that education should provide fair opportunities for every student. However, unequal funding, biased discipline, and long-term disadvantages show us that systemic racism still prevents this ideal from being realized. We've explored this through three examples. First, unequal school funding. Second, biased disciplinary practices. And third, the long-term effects of students' futures. Like the two students we imagined at the beginning, potential is equal, but opportunity is not. If we want education to truly be an equalizer, we must acknowledge these inequalities and take steps to create fair, supportive schools for every student. Only then can man's vision become a reality. Thank you.